So, in this video, I want to talk about the concept of the family. Now, I was inspired to make this video because I was talking to a friend of mine, and they claimed that blonde hair, quote, runs in their family. Now, I'm sure this person wasn't necessarily intending to do this, but implicitly, right, what they're doing is endorsing a kind of biological reification of the family concept. And they might not realize this, but this lends itself to genetic explanations of inequality. It's a kind of status quo justifying belief system. This perspective is very common in modern society, but what I'm going to argue in this video is that it's not justified, that in fact there is no such thing as the family concept, at least insofar as we're talking about biology. So the first thing to notice is that families are socially constructed units, right? So for instance, we can ask, where does one family end and another begin? Are cousins part of your family, second cousins, etc.? And there's no objective answer to this question, none given to us by nature. We decide that as a society. And in fact, if you know anything about history, you know that our concept of family has changed with time, and that even today, the concept of family differs between cultures. Now you might say, okay, we socially define these terms, but what does that matter? And it matters because the family concept historically and presently is linked to various kinds of oppression. So historically, of course, who ruled and who was ruled was largely a function of their family, right? You look at aristocracies, at monarchs, at dictators, oftentimes power is running through this family channel throughout history, and these historical inequalities, in fact, persist in effect to this day. And even if they didn't, the fact is that even our modern society still distributes privilege on the basis of this concept of family. And we can see this in terms of inheritance, in terms of networking, etc. Now some people will say, okay, maybe it has been linked in the past to oppression, and it is a social construct, but isn't it still also somehow biological? And so let's quickly run through the reasons for which that is not true. So in the first place, it's important to understand there are no pure family members, right? There's no one who is just 100% the member of and descended from one family and not descended from any other family. This notion of the pure family member does not exist. And if you look at history, it's really just the story of non-stop family mixing, right? Literally every generation, there's just more family mixing than you can count, and this should cast further doubt on the idea that families can biologically differ from one another. Now, another thing to point out is that there are no family genes, right? It's not as if whenever you find a family, everyone in that family will have a certain genotype that isn't present in the member of any other family. This sort of unique genotype just does not exist. Now, it's also important to note that by many definitions of the family concept, there is more genetic variation within families than between them. Again, suggesting that classifying people biologically on the basis of their family just doesn't really make much sense. Now, some people will say, but can't you predict what family someone is a part of on the basis of their genes? And yes, you can, but that is a choice. So you have to choose to use the genetic information that you have to make this specific prediction, the prediction of what family they're in. Now, you could predict other kinds of group membership, right? We could group people in innumerable ways, each of which would be predictable on the basis of their genes should we choose to examine the genetic information in that way. And so because of this, the genetic prediction argument just does not get you anywhere insofar as you're trying to show that somehow families are a real biological concept and not a social construct that is used to perpetuate status quo inequalities. And so you might get into an argument with someone and they might say something like, well, there are adoption studies and people seem to resemble their, quote, biological family, unquote, even when they're raised in a different environment. In terms of all sorts of traits, doesn't that suggest that there are genetic differences that matter between families? And of course, we can level a critique of these specific studies, right? We can talk about the fact that adoption studies often are not done in the most rigorous of ways, right? That there's contact between the supposedly separated parents and children. And we can also talk about things like prenatal environmental exposure that adoption studies don't touch at all. But the more fundamental thing to do is to not engage this evidence directly in the first place. The proper move is to question the very assumption that the family is a proper biological concept to begin with, while keeping in mind that this isn't suggesting that you're somehow denying that there is biological variation in the world, or again that you can predict someone's family on the basis of their genes. And obviously, if you choose to look at physical traits in this way, you might be able to even do this with them as well, at least certain shallow physical traits. But none of this, as I say, is evidence that the family concept is biologically real and that it is proper to use in a way that lets you talk about biologically based inequalities between people.